The Council of Galaxies was a vast and complex entity, a coalition of countless species from across the universe, each with its own set of rules, traditions, and methods of governance. It had lasted for millennia, its influence stretching far and wide, its power nearly absolute, but even in the heart of its most secure chambers, a quiet tension simmered. It was a gathering of the most powerful minds in the galaxy, but one could feel the disdain in the air. As humans entered the room, their presence felt as if they didn't belong here, as if their inclusion was merely a formality and nothing more. Ambassador Elena Rose sat at the head of the human delegation, her eyes scanning the room, her thoughts sharpened with every glance at the alien dignitaries seated around the circular table, their eyes cold and uninterested, at best their minds focused on their own agendas, rather than any meaningful discussion. There were whispers of mockery among the council members, subtle and fleeting, but enough for Elena to sense them. The humans were newcomers to this ancient institution, and no one seemed eager to give them the respect they had earned with their rapid growth. The council had been the governing body of the galaxy for generations, and while many of its members claimed to stand for peace, equality, and mutual benefit, the reality was different. Far too many species had suffered under the weight of its decisions, and too many had been silenced, all in the name of order. Elena knew this was something the humans couldn't accept. The truth of the council's corruption was buried deep, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic red tape and empty promises. But Elena and her team had been digging for years, hoping one day they would expose the lies. Today was supposed to be another routine meeting, another unimportant session, where the council would debate meaningless resolutions that would have little impact on the galaxy's real problems. The humans would once again be pushed aside as the old guard discussed their matters. But Elena had prepared something more than just words. She had prepared a plan, something that would finally bring the truth to light. She stood up and addressed the room, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the quiet murmur of the council members. She proposed a new initiative, something that could help unite the fractured galaxy, something that could give power back to the people who had been exploited for too long. She spoke of collaboration, sharing knowledge and technology, allowing every species to flourish. But the response from the council was swift, dismissive. They laughed at her words, mocking her idealism as naive. "You don't understand the way the galaxy works." Ambassador Rowe, a grizzled voice, echoed from one of the elder members of the council. "We've seen your kind before, always hoping to change the system. But it's the system that holds everything together. Without it, the galaxy would descend into chaos." Elena's fists clenched, but she held her composure. She had known this would happen. But the seeds of change were already being planted deep in the shadows of the council. The humans had not been idle. They had been working secretly to build alliances with the races the council had long ignored and oppressed. Small but determined factions were rising, and they had only one thing in mind: to take down the corrupted establishment from within. As the meeting continued, the tension between the humans and the council grew thicker. Elena's resolve hardened. She could feel it in her bones. Something was about to break. Something was about to change forever. Elena Rowe and her team returned to Earth with their heads held high despite the council's dismissal. Their mission had been clear, and while they had not won the council's approval, they had gathered something far more valuable: the seeds of a revolution. Humanity had not been idle during its time in the council, and the quiet work of countless scientists, diplomats, and strategists had begun to bear fruit. Back on Earth, the city streets bustled with activity as the world's leaders convened in secret meetings, their thoughts focused on the next steps in their grand strategy. Humanity had quietly begun to form alliances with species long oppressed by the council, races that had been hidden from the galaxy's gaze, ignored and forgotten. Now they were rising in unison, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. Their struggle for freedom matched humanity's, and the partnership between Earth and these species was growing stronger by the day. In a secure lab deep within Earth's capital, Nathan Caldwell sat hunched over a table scattered with ancient alien texts and devices. His fingers raced over holographic interfaces as he pieced together the puzzle before him. An artifact hidden for millennia, buried beneath the surface of Earth, had recently been unearthed during a routine excavation. Its origins were unknown, But its contents were not only ancient, they were world-changing. The artifact contained lost knowledge of the galaxy's true history, something that could bring the Council to its knees. The more Dar Caldwell uncovered, the more he realized just how deep the corruption of the Council ran. The artifact held records of wars that had never been told, of technologies that had been deliberately withheld from less advanced species, and of powerful forces that had shaped the galaxy's history from the shadows. The Council's claim to peace was a lie, and the evidence was now in the hands of humanity. As the days passed, the growing alliance of rebel species received the humans' advanced technology, shield generators faster than light engines, and weapons based on designs hidden within the artifact. These alien races knew they had no chance against the might of the Council's fleet on their own, but with humanity's help they would stand a fighting chance, and so began the quiet preparation for the day when they would make their move. Elena knew that time was running out. The Council's power was based on control over knowledge and technology, and as humanity's technological prowess grew, so did their influence. The galaxy's largest corporations had already begun to feel the pressure as humanity's new tech began to dominate key industries. While some Council members had dismissed Earth's advancements as fleeting, others had begun to take notice and grow concerned, especially as rumors of humanity's newfound allies began to spread. Back in the Council chambers, those who had previously ignored or laughed at the human delegation were starting to reconsider their stance. But it was too late. The gears were already turning. The alliances were already in place. The galaxy was on the brink of something new, and whether the Council liked it or not, humanity was no longer a fringe player. They were a force to be reckoned with. Elena Rose sat in her office looking out over Earth's shining skyline. Her heart was heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The battle for the future of the galaxy was about to begin, and Earth would be at the center of it all. Their first move was coming soon, and they would not back down. The Council had gathered again for what was supposed to be a routine meeting, but the air felt different this time. The room buzzed with tension as ambassadors from every corner of the galaxy filed in, their faces hard with uncertainty. Some whispered in corners, others stared ahead with determination. There was something in the air, a quiet sense that the galaxy was on the brink of change. Elena Rose sat at the head of the human delegation, her hands folded in front of her, her mind sharp as a blade. She had spent countless nights preparing for this day, and now it had arrived, the moment she had been waiting for, when everything would shift. The plan was in motion, the allies were in place, and the Council had no idea what was coming. As the session began, the Council members sat in their usual seats, their voices rising with practiced authority as they debated trade agreements and minor disputes. But Elena's eyes were fixed on the grand table, the hub of the galaxy's power. The same faces she had come to know and distrust were present today. But this time they were not looking at her with indifference. Today they seemed nervous. It was as if they knew something was coming but couldn't quite place it. Something in the way the humans had been gathering strength made them uneasy. Though they refused to show it, their arrogance had long clouded their judgment. But now it was beginning to crack, and Elena could see it in the way they avoided eye contact, in the way they hesitated before speaking. As the meeting continued, Elena stood. She could feel every eye in the room turned toward her. The time had come to reveal what she had been holding back. With a quiet breath, she activated a holoprojector at the center of the table, and the room fell into a stunned silence. The hologram flickered to life, showing a series of images and data points that stunned even the most hardened Council members. The artifact that Dr. Nathan Caldwell had uncovered was now on display. Its true power, revealed to all, the records it held were irrefutable ancient texts detailing the history of the galaxy and the Council's rise to power. Elena's voice rang out with quiet authority as she spoke of the truth hidden within these records, how the Council's so-called peace was built on lies, how they had used subjugation and manipulation to maintain control over countless worlds. The room was silent. No one spoke at first. They just stared at the images flashing across the table. The faces of the Council members changed from disbelief to unease, and then to something more dangerous, fear. Elena could see it in their eyes. This was not the world they had controlled for so long. This was not the galaxy they had shaped to fit their will. A voice cut through the stillness. An elder member of the Council spoke, his tone dripping with contempt and disbelief. "This is preposterous." He said, "This is an insult to everything we've built. The artifact is a fabrication, a lie intended to destabilize everything we've worked for." But Alina stood her ground. She did not flinch. "The evidence is clear," she said, "and you all know it deep down. The Council has kept knowledge from the people. It has controlled. The truth has been hidden for too long, and now it's time for the galaxy to know the real story." The tension in the room was palpable. Some of the council members shifted uncomfortably, others clenched their fists, but Alina could feel the tide beginning to turn. The whispers had begun, the doubts were there, she could sense it in the air. The old order was crumbling, one word at a time. As the hologram continued to display the truth of the galaxy's past, Alina's heart raced, but she did not waver. She knew what came next. The council would try to suppress it. They would attempt to shut her down. But it was too late. The galaxy was already waking up, and the humans had ignited the spark that would change everything forever. The silence in the council chamber stretched on, heavy and thick. No one dared to speak for a moment as the hologram flickered with images of a galaxy that had been manipulated and shaped by the hands of the council for millennia. The truth was undeniable. The faces of the alien leaders had gone pale. Some were visibly sweating, while others refused to meet Alina's gaze. There was a murmur of disbelief rising among the ranks of the lower council members. The voices of the oppressed species, who had long been silenced, were growing louder and louder with every word spoken in that room. Ambassador Alina Rose stood motionless at the head of her delegation, her eyes scanning the faces of the council members. One by one, their unease, evident their once unshakable confidence, now faltering as the weight of their history threatened to crush them. The room had shifted. It was no longer just a debate, it was a reckoning. The artifact's holographic data continued to play across the room, revealing how the Council had fabricated entire histories, rewriting the truth of the galaxy's origins and the rise of its power through manipulation and violence. Alina could feel the eyes of her allies in the room. Their species had once been trampled by the Council's greed, their eyes now wide with the realization that their past struggles had not been in vain. The truth was being revealed, and there would be no going back. But then the first voice rose, breaking the heavy silence. It was a council member from one of the oldest races in the galaxy, his tone bitter and filled with contempt. "This is madness," he said, standing up from his seat. "You would claim that everything we've done has been for nothing, that all of our work has been a lie. You have no idea what it takes to govern a galaxy. You have no understanding of the power it requires to keep order." The elder's words echoed through the chamber as others began to murmur in agreement. But Alina did not flinch. She met his gaze with cold determination. "You've built an empire on lies," she said. "Your power has been based on keeping others in the dark. You call it order, but it is nothing more than control and fear." Her word hung in the air like a challenge, the tension in the room rising with each passing second. The anger of the council was palpable, but Alina could see the cracks beginning to form. The council's unity was dissolving. The facade of their righteousness was crumbling. Another voice interrupted this time. It was a younger council member, one who had always been quick to defend the status quo, but there was no confidence in his words. Now he hesitated before speaking. You can't just expose all of this and expect everything to change overnight," he stammered. "This galaxy has been ruled this way for centuries. We can't just destroy it." Alina's gaze hardened. "It's not about destroying it," she said. "It's about rebuilding it, about creating a future where every species has a voice, not just the powerful and the privileged. The galaxy cannot move forward until we face the truth of its past, and it starts here today." The room was no longer unified. The truth was spreading like wildfire among the council members. Some began to speak in whispers, others in louder voices, but the tension had reached a boiling point. Then, as the council erupted in chaos, a strange sound echoed through the chamber, the hum of a distant engine. The sound grew louder and louder until it reverberated through the walls. The council members paused and turned toward the source of the sound, their faces drained of color. The comm system crackled to life, and a voice rang out clear and sharp across the chamber. It was the voice of an unknown captain reporting from the far reaches of the galaxy. A fleet had just arrived. Human ships had entered the system, and they weren't alone. The voice over the comms sent a shiver through the council chamber, and for the first time in centuries, The ruling body of the galaxy felt vulnerable. Their once invincible walls seemed to close in around them. As the unknown fleet appeared on their screens, the voice of the captain was steady, but the message was clear. The galaxy was about to change. "We have arrived," the captain's voice echoed through the chamber. "We come in the name of freedom and alliance to end the era of the Council's rule." The Council's leaders exchanged tense glances. Some were still reeling from the revelations of the artifact, while others were already calculating their next move. But it was too late. The fleet was real, and it was enormous. On the holographic displays, human ships were appearing one after another, their sleek designs unfamiliar but unmistakably advanced. The human fleet was not alone, though surrounding their ships were dozens of vessels from species that had once been subjugated by the Council, races that had been long ignored, now standing united under the banner of a new order. Ambassador Elena Rowe felt a rush of satisfaction as she watched the holograms unfold before her eyes. The fleet that had gathered was the culmination of years of secret planning, the first step toward ending the Council's dominance. And what struck her most was not the size of the fleet, but the diversity of the ships, each one representing a species that had been denied its voice for far too long, each one representing a promise of hope for those who had been oppressed. She knew the Council would try to respond quickly. Their forces would be called into action within moments, but the humans and their allies had a head start. Their ships were already in position, and the Council's communication systems had been hacked by the human delegation earlier in the day. Their fleet's appearance was timed perfectly to take the Council by surprise. The senior members of the Council leaped into action. Some were shouting commands, others scrambling to activate their defenses. But it was clear their confidence had been shattered. Their carefully constructed facade of unity was beginning to fall apart. The battle for control of the galaxy was no longer an abstract idea. It was happening in real time, and for the first time in centuries, the Council was no longer the sole power in the room. A voice from one of the alien leaders echoed through the chamber, desperate and panicked. "They cannot be allowed to take us down. We cannot allow this rebellion to spread. We will crush them now before they grow any stronger." But it was too late. Elena stood tall in the center of the room, her gaze unwavering. As the chaos erupted around her, the plan was in motion. The forces were already converging, and the reality of their position was sinking in. For the Council members, they had underestimated humanity and the power of a united galaxy. Elena activated a secondary display, showing the alliances that had formed since the humans' arrival. Their fleets, their knowledge, their support were all in place. Now the time for debate was over. The time for action had arrived. The human fleet began its slow approach to the heart of the Council's power. They were not alone. There was a vast armada behind them, ready to strike at the heart of the corrupted system. It would not be a battle of force alone. It would be a battle of ideals, and humanity was ready to lead the charge. The Council's fate was sealed, and they could feel it in their bones. The rebellion had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The tension in the air was almost tangible as the human fleet and their allies began to advance toward the Council's headquarters. The once pristine Council facilities now stood as a symbol of centuries of corruption and control, but it wouldn't be for much longer. As human and alien ships began to position themselves in strategic locations around the planet, the Council's own defenses were quickly being neutralized. Elena Rowe stood at the command center aboard Earth's flagship Stellar Dawn, her gaze fixed on the main holoscreen. The vast expanse of the fleet spread out in front of her like a living entity, every ship representing a species that had endured under the Council's rule for far too long. The time for diplomacy was over, and now it was time for action. She knew the next few hours would determine the fate of the galaxy. The fleet was composed of every type of vessel imaginable, from the sleek human warships to the massive ships of the long-forgotten races that had been given new life through technology the humans had shared with them. They were united under a common cause, and each ship was more than just a vessel. It was a symbol of defiance, a testament to the strength of those who had once been silenced. On the surface of the Council's homeworld, alarms blared as the defenses began to fail. The first wave of ships had already disabled key planetary shields, and now the skies were filling with ships from every corner of the galaxy. The Council's once invulnerable command center now looked more like a target waiting to be struck. Council members scrambled to make sense of the situation. Some gave frantic orders, while others simply stared at the screens, unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster unfolding before them. They had always assumed they were untouchable. The fear in their eyes was growing palpable. They had underestimated humanity's will to fight and the depth of the alliances that had formed under Earth's leadership. On the ground, Alina's allies were already beginning their mission. She had sent teams to infiltrate the heart of the Council's political apparatus with the goal of neutralizing key leaders and dismantling the Council's power structure from within. These were not just soldiers, they were diplomats, warriors, and scientists working together to bring down the last bastion of oppression in the galaxy. The battle for control of the Council's homeworld raged on, but it was clear that the human-led alliance was gaining ground at every turn. The Council's elite forces fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched by the combined might of the galaxy's most oppressed and marginalized species. Meanwhile, on the stellar dawn, Alina received a communication from Dr. Nathan Caldwell, the scientist who had uncovered the artifact that had exposed the Council's lies. He had been coordinating the technological side of the rebellion, and his voice came through crisp and clear as the data flowed in from the battlefield. "We've breached their inner sanctum, Alina," he said. "We've disabled their final defense grid, and the leaders are scattering. We're closing in on them now." Alina's heart raced as the news came, and the end was in sight. The Council's reign of fear and manipulation was drawing to a close, but there was no time to savor the victory. Yet they had to move quickly if they were going to ensure that the Council leaders couldn't escape and regroup. The stellar dawn shifted its course, its weapon systems coming online, as the fleet's flagship positioned itself above the Council capital, its target now in sight. The final battle was about to begin, but this time it wouldn't be fought with weapons alone. It would be a battle of ideals, of vision, and of hope against the crushing weight of centuries of tyranny. Alina stood tall at the helm, watching the scene unfold, her fingers tapping the console in front of her as she prepared for what was to come. The Council had underestimated them all, and now the galaxy would see what humanity was capable of when pushed to the edge. The future was theirs to shape, and Alina knew they would never back down. The stellar dawn loomed over the Council's capital. Now the once proud city, gleaming with centuries of authority, was a shadow of its former self as the Allied fleet closed in around it. The enemy's defenses had been shattered, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The final phase of the rebellion was upon them, and every eye in the galaxy seemed to be focused on the outcome of this single moment. Alina stood on the bridge, her expression resolute, as she watched the monitors displaying the battle that was unfolding below. The once impenetrable Council stronghold was now a war zone. Every inch of the ground was contested as Alina's forces advanced on their targets. Troops from dozens of species had already landed and began their push toward the Council's central complex in an effort to dismantle the heart of the corrupt government from within. On the surface, the fighting was fierce, but it was clear the Council's forces were struggling. Their shock at the suddenness of the attack had left them disorganized. Their elite soldiers still fought valiantly, but they had no chance against the united front of species that had been crushed under the weight of the Council's empire. For so long they fought not just for survival, but for the future of every world that had been subjugated under the Council's oppressive rule. Alina's communicator buzzed as Dr. Caldwell's voice came through again, this time with urgency. "They're attempting to launch a counterattack from their underground facilities, Alina," he said. "Their most loyal forces are retreating down into the hidden bunkers. If they escape into the lower levels, they'll be able to regroup and pose a significant threat to the success of the rebellion. We need to stop them now." Alina's jaw clenched as she considered the implications. If the Council leadership managed to escape, they could rally their remaining forces and possibly turn the tide of the war. But she knew her allies had already anticipated this kind of move, and plans had been put into place to prevent it from happening. Under her orders, a specialized force of elite soldiers and engineers had been dispatched to intercept any retreating Council members. They would block off access to the underground tunnels and ensure that the leaders of the Council were brought to justice before they had a chance to regroup. But it wasn't just about military victory anymore. It was about something more fundamental. This battle wasn't merely a clash of armies. It was a fight for the soul of the galaxy, a fight to reclaim the right of every species to have their voice heard, a fight to restore balance to a universe that had been broken by the Council's long reign of deception and control. As Elena reviewed the status reports, her mind raced through countless contingencies. This battle was far from over, and the next few hours would determine whether they had truly won, or if the Council would manage to strike back in some form. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a brief moment of hope. Their efforts had not been in vain. The transmission from Dr. Caldwell interrupted her thoughts. The Council's remaining leadership has been cornered, Elena. He said they're trying to make one final escape through their emergency pods. We have them trapped, but they're not going down without a fight. Elena's heart raced as the news sank in. They were almost there. They had come this far, and the galaxy was on the cusp of change. She activated the ship-wide comms to address her forces. All units push forward now. We have them cornered. This ends today. No one gets away from justice. As the final forces closed in on the last pockets of resistance in the Council's stronghold, Elena knew this wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new era, one that would forever alter the course of history and bring the promise of freedom and equality to every corner of the galaxy. The galaxy had fought long and hard for this moment, and now it would take its first steps toward a future without fear. The last of the Council's emergency escape pods were disabled before they could even launch. Their desperate bid for survival had failed, and their fate was sealed. The final battle had been fought. The Council had been shattered, and the galaxy stood on the precipice of a new dawn. Elena Rowe watched from the command center aboard the Stellar Dawn as the final reports came, and the Council leaders had been apprehended. Their strongholds had been dismantled, and the galaxy was no longer under the iron grip of their control. The battlefield had fallen eerily silent after hours of intense fighting. The once thriving center of power now lay in ruins, but even in the wake of the destruction, there was an undeniable sense of victory. Humanity and its allies had done what many thought impossible. They had toppled the greatest power in the galaxy and restored hope to those who had long been oppressed. Elena stood at the center of the bridge, her eyes scanning the status reports as the remaining resistance forces scattered. The Alliance had won, but the weight of what had been accomplished settled heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a cultural revolution, the first steps toward a galaxy united not under fear and oppression, but under the principles of cooperation and shared knowledge. She knew the hard work was just beginning. The fall of the Council was only the beginning of rebuilding a fractured galaxy. The real challenge now would be ensuring that the new leadership would represent the diverse voices of all species, not just the powerful and the privileged, but every world and every people who had suffered for so long. The momentary silence on the Stellar Dawn was broken as a voice came over the comms. It was Dark Caldwell again, his tone filled with relief. "The leaders have been secured, Elena," he said. "They're all being brought to the holding facilities. We've cleared the underground bunkers. The galaxy is free." Elena exhaled slowly. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The victory was theirs. The war was over, but the work of rebuilding the galaxy had only just begun. Across the galaxy, the news spread quickly. The corrupt Council was no more. The species that had long been silenced were taking their first steps into the light. They were no longer pawns in the game of galactic politics. They were free to make their own choices and shape their own futures. On Earth, Elena addressed a global audience, her words broadcast across the stars to every corner of the galaxy. "Today, the Council has fallen," she began. "Today, we stand at the threshold of a new era, where every species has the right to their own voice. No longer will we stand by as those with power crush the hopes of the many. Today, we take the first steps toward a galaxy united in equality, freedom, and respect." The applause was deafening as her message rang out across the broadcast networks. The people of Earth and their allies celebrated the victory, but it was not just their victory. It was the victory of every species that had stood up to the Council. It was the victory of a galaxy that refused to be shackled any longer. As the celebrations continued, Elena stood in quiet reflection. The war had cost them much, and the scars of the Council's reign would not disappear overnight. But she knew one thing for certain: the galaxy had changed forever, and Earth had played a pivotal role in that transformation. The galaxy was not perfect, But for the first time in history, it was no longer ruled by a single tyrannical force. It was a galaxy where every species had a chance to thrive, where the voices of the oppressed would no longer be ignored, and where the ideals of freedom and equality would guide the future. As Elena looked out over Earth's skyline, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that they had built something that would last, something that would ensure the future of the galaxy would be brighter for all who called it home. The Council's end had come at their last meeting, and the galaxy had been reborn.